Hey everybody, welcome to the Dyslexic Linguist YouTube channel. My name is Hope, and today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things to talk about, autism and linguistics. So, if you know anything about linguistics or autism, or if you know nothing about either of those things, this video is for you because I'm going to be talking about autism in a way that is not very common. I don't know that many other people that see autism from the way that I see it. So I'm hoping that whoever is out there watching this will learn something new, because I've talked to a lot of different people, linguists, non-linguists, people that have worked with autism or studied people with special needs, people that know nothing about any of these things. And there's always something that people can learn. Of course, I am always learning as well. And so I hope you stick around, because this video is going to be a little bit long, and there's actually going to be a part 2. I'm going to call it the Autism Industrial Complex. I'm not the first to create that term, but that's what I'm calling the video. So to start off, human nature is to be linguistic. Karl Marx said that human nature is to be social. I think at the core of being social is language. That's basically what our evolution revolved around, was our ability to use speech, but at first it was sign language. So, you can see just in our physiology how core language is to our bodies. Our ability to use fine motor movement, to use sign language, but now, of course, most people use our articulatory systems. That's our vocal cords, our mandible, and our lips, our tongues, etc. So I'm sure, as you know, language is affected by autism, and I think that's what's really at the core of what autism is language differences. And so that ends up having social differences as well, and that's really how autism is defined, is by, they usually don't call it social differences, it's some kind of social deficit, but as I hope you'll come to see, is I don't really see it that way, as a deficit. I really do think of it as a difference. And I think that it can be proven that it's not a deficit, that it is a difference. And of course, autism is in the news right now, not for very good reasons, and that's really what provided me with some amount of urgency to make this video, because the time is now, I think, for us to collectively change our minds about what it means to be autistic and what it means to be autistic in this world that we live in, because I don't think the status quo is acceptable. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because I kind of already am. So we have to start off with some really, really basic things. First, about linguistics, and then I'm going to talk about some basic things about autism, and then we're going to talk about autism and language. So there's going to be a little bit of back and forth, but just stick with me. So we're starting off really simple. The first thing that you need to know about linguistics is the difference between internal language and external language. Right now, I am externalizing language, but I also have language going on up here. That's what's allowing me to talk. But I have internal language even when I'm not talking. Within our brains, there is a very big distinction between internal language and external language, such that our cognitive language comes from different parts of the brain. So the speech creation part of the brain, that's our physical ability to produce sounds or to produce signs, that is in a different part of the brain from our ability to think linguistically. And our linguistic abilities, number 2, are innate. So this is a relatively, I don't know if controversial is the right word. The concept of innatism is more accepted by some than others. Some people accept different parts of innatism. And by people, I mean linguists. But basically the idea is that we have a biological capacity to have language and to acquire language. So language acquisition is not the same thing as language learning. When you learn a language, that is not going to be your first language. So learning a language means, you're on Duolingo or you're doing some kind of conscious effort to learn the rules and learn the grammar of another language. But it isn't just second nature. It's something that you have to consciously put effort into doing. Language acquisition, on the other hand, is what happens in very young children between about the ages of, 0 to 7, where children very, very, very rapidly acquire language and develop language. If you remember being a kid, or, if you have kids or been around kids, just how rapid it is that they learn new words, and just how rapid it is that they become so fluent so quickly. It's actually kind of shocking. Because language acquisition is so rapid, there's a lot of statistical evidence to show that this isn't a conscious language learning process. There's no way that, especially at the peak of word learning in children, the volumes of information are so great, so large, that it's basically impossible that it could be anything other than a kind of biological faculty. So specifically what that biological faculty is not really understood yet. There are different parts of the brain, like I said, that we know are associated with different aspects of language. And there are specific genes that have been identified. FOXP2, for example, has been identified as being related to language, absolutely being related to language, but we don't know what causes language, right? There is no, there's no one gene or one region of the brain that does all of the language. We don't really totally understand where it comes from yet. So innatism comes from something called the critical period hypothesis, which says that in between the ages of 0 to 7, when our brains are acquiring or reaching their full weight, that is when we acquire language. So you have to be exposed to language. You have to be around, of course, your parents talking, but anyone else talking or using sign language. And that's how we acquire language. If you're not exposed to language, in that time period, if you're not around language, then you may never fully acquire language. So the question of what happens if you were never exposed to language as a child is also not really totally known. Of course, it would be extremely, extremely, extremely unethical to perform some kind of experiment that would prevent a child from being exposed to language. That would be absolutely terrible. So that's, of course, that's not something that's ever happened. But I'm going to be talking about a case a little bit later where there was a particular individual had very limited exposure to language and what the result of that was. But that's quite a bit farther ahead. So the last really important concept about linguistics, which I think is honestly probably one of the most foundational concepts in linguistics in general, is the idea of the equality of language. So if you've ever heard someone say that you're using bad grammar, or that a dialect, or what in linguistics is called a variation, the variation of whatever language you speak is somehow inferior to the standard language, that is not true. There is no such thing as language inferiority. There is no such thing as bad grammar. There's such thing as social constructs that can convince us that our grammar is bad or that our language is inferior or superior, but grammatically, that is not true. I'm not just saying this because I'm a nice person and because I think everyone is equal and, something like that. It's not my feeling that language is equal. It's something that has really been proven over time. is that language requires a certain amount of structure and information that you can't have any less or more. So language is almost infinitely diverse in the kinds of features that they have. So just because there's one feature in one language that's not present in another language does not mean that there's something missing from that language. And there are a million different examples I could provide. So in English, we have a lot of different articles like a and the. In a language like Russian, there are no articles like that. That doesn't mean that Russian is missing information. It means that what's actually going on is that it has a totally different grammatical system from English. And just because English doesn't have a lot of the features that Russian has, doesn't mean that English is inferior. It doesn't mean that either one is superior. And within language families, there's no such thing as a dialect, where there's an offshoot of a language or a mutation of a language, and then there's the standard pure language that comes from. There's no such thing as purity in a language. There's no such thing as like a stupid language or like a bastardization of a language. That's just not how grammar works. So I think that's one of the main missions of linguistics, is to show this huge diversity of features in different languages, and seeing how they operate and what function they play in any particular language. So research has come to show that the core of this equality is probably a physical phenomenon, and physical as in the laws of physics. So in general, one of the main ways to show syntax or structure of language is through what are called syntax trees. The main theory behind these syntax trees, the most mainstream theory, or one of the most mainstream theories, is called X-bar. So in X-bar, there's this concept called C command, where essentially certain nodes are kind of dominate other lower nodes. And at each level of C command, I hope I'm explaining this right, because guys, this is not my expertise. But basically at each level of C command within a tree, the rate that it increases is at the same rate as the Fibonacci sequence. So if you've never heard of the Fibonacci sequence, because you're a normal person or because you've never read the Da Vinci Code, basically it's fractals. And we have all seen fractals in so many different areas of life. It's kind of a really fundamental part of physics. So that is basically what our language is based on, is this really fundamental law of physics that kind of defines a lot of things in our universe. That's what I mean when I say that this isn't just my opinion, it's not just my feeling that all language is equal. It's seriously, you literally can't have bad grammar. You literally cannot speak an inferior language. You cannot speak a superior language. It is not possible by the laws of physics. But of course, there are social constructs that make us believe otherwise. That's going to be a really huge part of this video and part 2 as well. That our ideas of what it means to speak a superior language or speak it in a superior way is very, very, very consequential and a very serious misconception that we all need to be aware of, which is a big part of the reason why I think linguistics is something that everyone should learn about, because I think it really changes the way that you see the world and, you see yourself in your relationships, because language is just so fundamental as, like, the way we operate as a species. So if you believe that our most core aspect of our beings can be good or bad in a way that's actually not possible, that has huge consequences for so many areas of our lives. And as you'll see, especially in the lives of people with autism. So moving on to autism, autism is defined as a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder. the full term for autism is autism spectrum disorder, so you might see it written as ASD. That just means autism. The idea of autism being a disorder is not set in stone. It's pretty controversial in a lot of different ways. And because really, as we'll get into, even the idea of disability, of what it means to have a disability, is very much a social construct. So depending on what culture you're from, what part of the world you're from, or, even what time in human history you're from, what it means to have a disability means many, many different things to many different people. So there are a lot of societies that don't even have a word for disability. That doesn't mean they don't have things like autism or other conditions. That means that they see them differently. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this video, that this is very much a Western-centric perspective on autism, like a Eurocentric perspective on autism. And that is really, once again, very consequential for how we view autism, is through a very specific lens that is in no way universal to all societies and all people with autism. So similarly to how we haven't identified any specific language gene or identified a cause of language, we haven't identified a cause of autism either. There's no specific autism gene, there's no brain region that is associated with autism. There kind of are trends, though, where, autistic brains tend to be one way or another, but there's never one consistent feature that's found in all autistic brains. So, for example, for a really long time, there was an idea that the amygdala was kind of the key to understanding what caused autism, basically because it was pretty common to find a smaller than average amygdala, but as time has gone on, it's not all about the amygdala. It's not all about any one thing or any one chemical, though there might be tendencies for the amygdala to be smaller on average or something like that. But it's not all people with autism. There are people who have oversized amygdalas, or for any given trend in traits or like biological traits of autism, there is always the inverse. There is always the opposite. So it's never just one thing, and it can also look pretty typical compared to neurotypical brains. So it's not like if you've ever seen photos of like a brain with extremely late stage Alzheimer's or a brain with severe alcoholism, you can visibly see very significant physical differences between a typical brain and a non-typical brain. That is not how it is for autism. It's not something that you could just see with the naked eye. A lot of the time, even through brain scans, there's not necessarily a huge difference. But there certainly isn't some kind of like huge impairment in the autistic brain. And that's something that people have kind of been looking for a really long time, is some kind of flaw. But what they've seen is actually autistic brains are pretty remarkably similar to non-autistic brains. The two biggest differences, though, I will say, are pretty newly discovered. So the first thing is what's called functional connectivity patterns, molecular connectivity patterns. And so that's been seen through functional MRIs, which is a scan of the surface of the brain. And basically, everyone has a pattern. Guys, I'm not a neurologist. I'm not going to explain this perfectly, but we all have kind of molecular patterns in our brains. In non-autistic or allistic brains, there's a very consistent pattern. All of these patterns in non-autistic brains are very, very similar. the range of connectivity is much smaller compared to autistic brains. In autistic brains, these functional connectivity patterns are all unique. Every single one is unique, and you can see that in fMRIs. Not only that, but the range of connectivity is much wider in brains with autism. So usually it's a combination of underconnectivity and overconnectivity in different regions of the brain, but it's a much wider range than what's seen in non-autistic brains. And so, potentially that could be a way to identify autism. Once again, this is very new. This is a very new thing, and it's also very expensive, to do fMRIs. So it's not something that's used for diagnosis at all. fMRIs are not used for autism diagnosis, as of now anyway. The other thing, which is also very new, is differences in the gut microbiome. So from stool samples, actually, scientists have been able to see that there is a difference in the gut microbiome. In, autistic gut microbiomes, there's something different that's going on. Once again, I can't tell you exactly what that is because I'm not, this isn't what I look at, but there's a potential that in the future that autism diagnosis could be based on stool samples, which I think would really change a lot of things about how research on autism is conducted and how we view autism. But these are both very recent developments. So with both of these biological markers of autism, there's not just one way that they look. There is a range of what it means to, have an autistic gut microbiome or functional connectivity pattern. There's no one way that it looks. There's no one specific trait of autism, right? There's no specific biological trait. And so before I move on to talking about autism and language, I should tell you a little bit about the official diagnostic criteria of autism that you can find in the DSM-5 or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition. That's the most recent edition. The way that the DSM-5 defines autism is not totally settled science. It's very, very controversial. The main pillar of the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 is basically social deficits, or, social awkwardness. So that's issues with communication, issues with relationships, etc. And the other, kind of secondary traits are sensory differences, so that's being hypersensitive or hyposensitive. That means less sensitive than normal. And that last main trait of autism is, other than the language differences, which is one of the defining features, is RRB, repetitive behaviors and restricted interests. Typically, repetitive behaviors, that means stimming, but also having restrictive schedules and routines. So if something changes unexpectedly in your routine, or even if it is expected, that can be very, very difficult for autistic people to deal with. Stimming, which the full term is self-stimulatory behavior, is essentially a self-soothing kind of behavior. Basically everyone stims, but the thing about, stimming and autism is that there's kind of this range of how voluntary it is. So for some people, they might need to stim a lot more than other people, or it might be a lot harder to control it once you begin. And for restricted interests, I'm sure you've heard the term special interest. That's kind of been a little bit trendy recently. I'm gonna make a video in the future about the internetification of autism terminology and how social media has had very interesting effects on how particular traits of autism have come to be seen. And so one of the biggest problems with the way that autism is defined now is that, and I'm not the first to say this, but it's basically so broad that it is almost meaningless. So the way autism used to be defined was kind of by different subtypes. I'm sure you've heard Asperger's. I think it was Chris Rock came out a couple years ago saying that he had PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. There were other subtypes as well, but those were the two main ones. And the biggest issues with them was that they didn't have a concrete definition. The idea was basically that people with PDD-NOS or Asperger's had higher language or higher speech, as we'll see, it's really about the speech capabilities than who was considered to be autistic, but they couldn't specifically define or find distinctions between autism and Asperger's. So they made it, and in a lot of ways this was a good thing, to make it autism a spectrum, like an umbrella term that fit in all of these subtypes. But the problem is that it became too general. So, for example, there was a study that took people that had previously been diagnosed with PDD-NOS or Asperger's and had them re-evaluated under the new DSM-5 criteria. And what they found is that those people that were previously diagnosed as having one of the subtypes were far less likely to be diagnosed with autism. So people that should be considered autistic that might have more, mild symptoms of autism are less likely to be diagnosed under the new paradigm. In general, if you are a woman, if you are a racial or ethnic minority, if you have comorbidities, it makes you less likely to be diagnosed with autism. If you're an adult, that makes your chance of being diagnosed drop. And so this is like most people, right? Most people are one of these things. So there are a lot of problems to the way, if you define autism as being a condition of having social deficits, then that is very subjective. And if anything, it's cultural. So, so that's why if you're a woman and you're socialized to being more social, which we have data to show that's how women are socialized, that does not align with the general conception of what autism looks like. So even women that have more significant traits of autism, that have more classical presentations of autism, are less likely to be diagnosed than men. So it's not just high-functioning women. That also includes, low-functioning women. With racial and ethnic minorities in the United States, if you live in a predominantly black or brown area, your ability to access resources is much more limited. So the age at which you get diagnosed is typically later, but even if you do get diagnosed, you are far less likely to be able to access any resources as a result of that. The last thing before I go on, these terms, high and low functioning, are so bad for so many reasons. So even though the DSM-5 criteria is so overbroad as to be almost meaningless, they still have some stipulations. So there's high or low functioning, and then there is 3 levels of support needs, and then the last stipulation is language impaired or language unimpaired. For high and low functioning, obviously the term low functioning is ableist. I don't think I really need to explain why, but to be labeled low functioning is really, really stigmatizing. And for high functioning, there are still a lot of problems with that because it kind of implies a less significant experience with autism. It kind of minimalizes or trivializes the experiences of autism that quote-unquote high-functioning people have. The book Unmasking Autism by Devin Price goes into this into much farther depth than I can get into right now. I really recommend that book. And so basically, being high-functioning can present very unique challenges for people who are labeled that way. For the support needs, basically, level 1 is like less support, level 2 is more support, level 3 is basically 24/7 support from other people, help from other people. So finally, there is language impaired, language unimpaired. It's not as simple as you are one or the other. That's what the rest of this video is going to be about. Not to get too far into what the issues with that are. Overall, this tendency to categorize autism into a false binary has been going on since autism was discovered. First, it was either you have Asperger's or autism, then it became high or low functioning, language impaired or language unimpaired. It's a spectrum. Even though the DSM-5 changed the definition to supposedly make it a spectrum, they didn't actually do that because it's still categorized under a kind of binary paradigm. And so that brings us to language in autism. As you'll come to see, this is a huge spectrum of what language looks like in autism. It is simply not impaired or unimpaired. It's not that simple. So that's the DSM-5. So for the DSM-5 definition, it's really behavioral. And when it comes to these neurological, biological traits of autism, the last important thing that you need to know with reference to the basics of autism that I just went over is that the autistic brain tends to be larger than average. In addition to that, there can be very rapid brain growth in early childhood. So if you remember the critical period hypothesis graph of language acquisition is defined by the brain coming into its full weight. If the autistic brain doesn't follow that same pattern or doesn't necessarily follow the same trajectory as the typical brain in how it acquires its full weight, because it reaches its full weight earlier or because it simply weighs more, then that's going to affect how language is acquired. And one of the main stipulations of the critical period hypothesis is that there is one way to acquire language. So there is one particular pathology, this is the claim, that every single child follows, if, of course, they are exposed to language properly. So there are specific milestones that children reach at specific times. For example, at 3 years old, or maybe a little bit earlier, there's a huge boost in vocabulary. But there are a lot of other milestones that you're supposed to hit at specific times. And that's the main claim of the critical period hypothesis, is that the way that you acquire language is specific, and there's just one way for it to happen. So before we go on, I want to quickly mention DLD, developmental language disorder. It used to be called specific language impairment, because essentially what DLD is a developmental disorder where people have specific issues with specific grammatical constructions. Like I said before, there's no such thing as speaking language in an inferior way. What DLD is specific issues with specific parts of grammar. So it's not just it's not random problems with random parts of speech, and it's not an overall, deficiency in language. But there's a really big spectrum in DLD, and it's really, the way that is connected to autism really is not very well understood yet. Some people say that it is totally separate from autism. There are a lot of different perspectives with DLD. It's not totally understood. That is going to be something that's going to come up in a little bit, but I just thought I should mention that before we really get into autism, because DLD is a relatively common thing. Basically, as it's understood, is that it does affect your ability to be social, because if you have any kind of issues with language, it affects your ability to be social. But people say that it affects your ability to be social differently from autism. That is not the consensus. It's really not, DLD is really not very well understood. So first I want to talk about some basic aspects of language and autism. Most of this is going to come from a paper titled Language and Speech Characteristics in Autism by Vaughan-Drukas 2022. This has been a really important paper for my research. It's really comprehensive. It's a literature review of all of the different aspects of language and autism. So it's a pretty long paper. There are different sections of it. I'm going to break it into two main sections. So there are two main parts to this paper. I'm going to kind of combine several parts of the paper into two big parts. So just to begin, they say that there is a portion of the autistic population that has exceptional language capabilities. Not only that, but they're practically indistinguishable from non-autistic people. So just as a quick sidebar, I've been studying autism for a few years now. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people from many different backgrounds in education and whatever else. And, talking to people about autism, kind of the pattern that I've seen is that I think people think that they know what autism is, when that might not really be the case. So I think if I were to do something if I were to put out a survey or something that asked, can you just tell when a person is autistic? When you meet someone, can you tell if they're autistic? I think for the most part, people would be pretty confident and say yes, I do know. But if I were to ask them, okay, then what is autism? And of course, autism is notoriously difficult to define. They would probably be a lot less confident in their answer. And, this is an educational video, so I'm going to try to keep it appropriate. But this isn't too far removed from the Supreme Court definition of obscenity, which is, I know it when I see it. I think a lot of people think about autism in the I know it when I see it way, when they do not always know it when they see it. I mean, to the point where there are so many people, especially recently, that have lived their entire lives with autism and then recently been diagnosed or self-diagnosed or whatever. So you can be autistic and you can live your whole life with autism and not know. And so with this, the fact that people can have speech that is practically indistinguishable from non-autistic speech, the idea that you can just know when another person is autistic is really, really, really questionable. One of the really important points from Vaughan-Drukas 2022 is that even though autism is invisible, it is audible. The first indication of autism to other people is the way that you speak. So there is, as we'll get into, there are particular traits of autistic speech patterns that are identified almost instantly by, with our ears. That doesn't mean that people automatically go, oh, this person is autistic. They'll think this person is different in some way, or maybe they're weird or awkward or whatever it is. So these speech patterns, so I'll read a passage straight from the paper. Monotone, robotic, staccato, jerky, and sing-songy, and inconsistent porosity has been described as among the first identifiable characteristics that can create an impression of oddness among children with autism. And of course, that also includes adults as well. Some of the other traits are cluttering or stuttering, speaking volume being too loud or too quiet. And so within speech patterns and phonology, there are a lot of different ways that autistic speech patterns can be very unique. And so the other kind of section of the paper is pragmatic and semantic differences and these are kind of, stereotypical, taking any kind of figurative language too literally, taking sarcasm, hyperbole too literally. Other things like not initiating conversations, not asking questions or commenting unless someone, explicitly asks them or prompts them in some way. Other things like being inappropriate, not necessarily being inappropriate as in like vulgar, but just like being inappropriate as in like the context, whatever context you're in, whatever you're saying isn't quite socially acceptable. So once again, reading straight from the paper, if you use A, hyperinformation, which is not necessary, B, vocabulary and grammar used in written speech and not in oral speech, C, repetitions and corrections that are not necessary. And this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the more significant things that I identified. But when it comes to these pragmatic differences, once again, this is a social construct. So we have to question, do autistic people inherently have pragmatic issues in their language? Or is it that autistic people tend to have pragmatic issues when they are surrounded by non-autistic people? A paper titled Autistic Peer-to-Peer Information Transfer is Highly Effective from 2020 ran an experiment where they took two different groups of people. One group was autistic, the other group was non-autistic, and they basically had them play a game of telephone where within each line they would start off, the first person would start with a story, tell it to the next person, and by the end they would measure the amount of, or they would add up the amount of details that were successfully transferred throughout the chain of people. In these individual chains of autistic and non-autistic, separately, they were basically equal in the amount, in the efficacy of the communication. But then they combined the two chains, where it was, non-autistic, autistic, non-autistic, autistic, so on. And that chain was relatively unsuccessful compared to the other two. And so this goes to show that maybe it's not just a fact of life that autistic people are inherently socially awkward, because if they're around other autistic people, then I think some things might change. And so this is a pretty unique paper. Keep that in mind when I say that there are these pragmatic problems or these semantic problems, is that once again might be a bit of a social construct. So now we are going to get into language acquisition and language development. You can kind of use those terms interchangeably. The main term that people use now is language development. So if we think back to the critical period hypothesis, the idea that there is one single language pathology that all children follow when they have been properly exposed to language, there is a specific pathology with specific milestones that you have to go through in order to acquire language. When I was taking, Linguistics 101 and learning about the critical period hypothesis, I was sitting there and I was like, well, what about, language delays, right? I'm pretty sure Albert Einstein, this is me at the time, I'm pretty sure Albert Einstein wasn't able to speak or was practically mute until he was, 5 years old, so, he is autistic, or he was autistic. So, from the very beginning, I was questioning the critical period hypothesis, But it wasn't until, I guess, more recently that I became more confident in the fact that I think there's a lot missing from the critical period hypothesis. In general, like, I think, yes, of course, like, you have to be exposed to language in early childhood. You can't just, like, psychically acquire language. But the idea that it's so strict, that there's just one pathology, that I find very questionable. So in Wagendruck's 2022, they didn't really focus on these kind of language pathologies. So what we're going to focus on before I get into them is hyperlexia, language regression, and language delays. Before we get into the specifics, in Wagendruck's 2022, they talked about, these different features of the language and autism. But when it came to these pathologies that I'm going to talk about in a second, they did not really touch them at all. What they did do was, at the end of the paper, they created language profiles, or they proposed language profiles. So 4 different types. Really, it's like they say that the 4th one may or may not exist. I will talk about that one at the end. Essentially, to sum it up, type 1 is highly fluent speech with some pragmatic and semantic difficulties. Type 2 is autism comorbid with DLD, developmental language disorder. And type 3 is autism comorbid with intellectual disability. So intellectual disability, I believe, is an IQ of less than 50. So in general, IQ tests are not really regarded as doing what they set out to do. You can't quantify human intelligence into a single quotient. It's just not that simple. There's a lot of research that goes into how, if you're from different cultural backgrounds, or even if you've previously done an IQ test, you can do things to practice IQ, like different parts of IQ tests, so you can perform better when you take one. So the thing about IQ tests is that you need to be able to verbally respond to questions that they ask you. You also need to physically be able to move things. So like little blocks, but also like tapping on like an iPad or something like that. And so if you have physical limitations where you find it difficult to speak, or if you find it difficult to use fine motor movement to do things like rearrange blocks, that will falsely lower your IQ. So I roughly agree with these classifications, from high speech capabilities to more limited speech capabilities to less speech capabilities. But I don't think it has anything to do with IQ in the case of type 3. I think it has to do with motor function. So one of the main traits of non-speakers is, and overall with autism, I can't think of the exact term, but like your ability to like recognize the space around your body and sort of your hand-eye coordination, but especially there's this really huge correlation between issues with gross and fine motor movement. So gross is large and fine is like, writing or tying your shoes or something like that. So the higher issues you have with motor function, the higher issues you probably have with speech. Speech is a motor function. It's an extremely complex motor process. There are a lot of moving parts. Like I said at the beginning of the video, our articulatory system it's our vocal cords and our tongues and our lips. It's so many different things, in addition to like our breath control and things like that. And then even when it comes to sign language, you need fine motor movement. Even gross motor movement is a big part of sign language as well. And with writing or with typing, if you have very limited fine motor movement, that's going to have a really, really huge impact on your ability to communicate. So in general, non-speakers are labeled as having low IQ. Even if you can see, like, even if you can figure out whatever puzzle it is that they're trying to use to measure your IQ, if you can't physically perform the task that they need you to perform, then you're gonna get artificially marked down or marked lower than your actual IQ. So for most non-speakers, when they take an IQ test, I mean literally every single aspect of the test is not meant for them. And so what are you actually measuring? What are you measuring when that's the case? And so the other thing that they say in the paper is that it's global cognitive lags. How do you really know that? How can you really measure someone's cognition in that way? And just to give you an example, like, I think you could see pretty clearly if someone had, for example, if a person has a stroke, and previously they used to be able to do very complex math, and after the stroke they cannot do it anymore, then you can see that that's a cognitive issue, right? Something has changed and now they're having cognitive problems. For people that can't speak their whole lives, how do you know that they are having global cognitive lags? If you have no way to communicate with them, how can you really measure that? So, I agree and disagree with Vaughan-Drucas's language profiles in that regard. So let's get into hyperlexia first. In general, it's defined as advanced speech and reading skills co-occurring with a lack of comprehension. So when it comes to the early acquisition of these skills, this can be as early as 12 to 18 months, 18 months old, like really crazy young. The ability to read upside down or sideways, but really the core of it is not understanding or comprehending what is being said or what is being read. And most subjects that have hyperlexia are autistic. And I'll just go over all three of these really quickly and then come back to all of them. The next one is language regression. So in general, there's this concept of autistic regression where, there's such a broad range of experiences of what this means, of what it means to regress. Because basically it's like, for some people it can mean oh, my child was so happy and fun and just acted like a normal kid, but then as they got older they started to act differently. If as a child you're as a very young child you were able to stim a lot and use different or be able to express your autism in different ways, where as you get older social constraints and social expectations change. If you can't regulate yourself through stimming or through other ways that come naturally to you as an autistic person, then that will negatively affect you. That might make you, more withdrawn or aggressive or just depressed or whatever it is. So for some people, that's kind of what regression can mean, where it's not really a really severe change, but just a progressive change in behavior that is upsetting to parents. For the most part, autistic regression is defined in a much more severe way, where usually a child starts acquiring skills early. So usually language, speech and reading, and then over time they start to lose these skills. So they appear to be developing typically. Their motor skills were typical, their social skills, their language skills are all typical, and then it's usually a combination of the three regress in some way. The rate at which they regress is, that varies, so it can be very fast or very slow. It's assumed that there's a kind of a misconception in the rapidity of how it happens. So this is a really big thing behind the vaccine conspiracy. So if this is parents who say, my child wasn't autistic and then I gave them the vaccines, or they got the vaccines and then they started acting totally differently out of nowhere. And chances are is, number one, that kid was always autistic. You weren't born with autism. It's not something that can happen to you once you are born. You're either born autistic or you are not. Chances are is that these parents were probably missing signs of regression. The changes in these skills had already started to take place, but the parents just didn't know what they were looking for. So it appears to be a very rapid regression, when in reality it's probably not as rapid as they think it is. And so they associate it with things like vaccines. But it's a really important point that, and I can't remember the name of this paper, but children who regressed in language skills spoke at a significantly earlier age. Research in autistic regression has shown that these children that do regress tend to have acquired these skills, typically language skills, far earlier than the average child. In my time reading the literature, I personally have never found a study that looks at both autistic regression and hyperlexia, the co-occurrence of the two, which I think if you're listening to anything I just said, you'll see that there's clearly some amount of overlap that's happening there. If I'm wrong and there is some elusive study out there that exists that explores this topic, please let me know. But to my knowledge, and I've looked far and wide, I have not found anything where they study both hyperlexia and autistic regression. And so the next one is language delays. Basically, it doesn't mean you have to be entirely mute, but if your speech is very, very limited by the time you're about 4 to 8 years old, there are a lot of different ways to define these things. If you are not a fluent speaker by the time you're about 4 years old, then that can be defined as having language delays. But usually what happens is that these children, there are basically 3 different trajectories. Less than half of children with language delays end up acquiring fully fluent speech, and there's a portion of children that do end up speaking, but it's a more limited speech. And then finally, there are children that just never speak, right? And they're non-speaking their whole lives. Let's go back to these language profiles. So highly fluent, less fluent, and then non-speaking. So this second type of less fluent, I personally have called this intermediate speakers, this population intermediate speakers. I've seen them referred to as limited speakers or unreliable speakers, but in the actual autism literature, it's really not this group of people really isn't very well defined at all. And then when it comes to non-speakers, of course, there's nonverbal, minimally verbal, etc. But basically, these are people with very few words, very few phrases to no words, and if they do speak, it's not very intelligible by others. For the intermediate speakers and unreliable, limited speakers, whatever you want to call them, it's really, really interesting because even though this hasn't really been well defined in the literature at all, it's a really, really common thing. I have, and I'll talk about this a lot more in part 2, but I have worked with children with autism, and basically all of the kids that I've come across have been in this category of intermediate speakers. It really is shocking that it's so there's basically like no literature about this group of people. And so what happens, especially, so I'll go from the unreliable kind of definition, where there are two ways that their speech is unreliable. The first way is their actual ability to produce the speech. There's kind of a fluctuation in their ability to talk. So some days they might be initiating more conversations and asking questions, and they might be more quick, right, to respond. They're faster in their ability to talk. Other days, they might be a lot slower. And I don't mean like talking in slow motion. I mean like responding slower, or, you know, not initiating conversations as much or at all. But it varies from day to day. So the other way it's unreliable is the actual content of the speech, where they might say something, you know, they'll say something, but it might not be what they meant to say. You know, they're talking and you can understand perfectly fine what it is that they're saying, but it might not make very much sense, or it could be really, really repetitive, kind of saying the same thing over and over and over again, telling the same story kind of endlessly. And there's a similar thing in non-speakers, where even if they are speaking, the very limited speech that they do have, it's not what they mean to say. So they're talking, but it doesn't really make very much sense, or it, you know, in the context, or, you know, in whatever way. And so I've seen people that are in this intermediate category describe, basically, if they meet people in person, other people will assume that they are low functioning. And if they have interacted with other people through writing, you know, through email or text, or, you know, another person has read their writing, they'll assume that they're high functioning. And so there's this really crazy dichotomy where people, they can write perfectly fine, or maybe they you know, everyone's capabilities are different, but where these people they write totally fine. They don't have issues, like they don't have those motor issues of picking up a pencil and writing, or you know, typing on a keyboard. When it comes to speaking out of their mouths, there is a disconnect. The external language, the E language, doesn't align with the I language, right? So this is the same for non-speakers. If you don't have the motor skills to write or to articulate yourself, then all that's going to come out is whatever does come out is not going to match what is actually happening cognitively in your brain. And like I said before, the regions of the brain that, you know, deal with internal language versus physically being able to express language, those are two different parts of the brain. So if there is some kind of disconnect there, that means that even if they can talk just a little bit, whatever they say might not be what they mean to say, or they might not be able to express themselves at all. So with this intermediate category, like I said, it's really not discussed in literature. It's really not identified very well. It's from what I have seen. Like, that's why I came up with that term, because I don't know what else to call it, because empirically, like, you can read about people that are like this, but also just in my experience, like, there are so many people that are like this. When it comes to non-speakers, it's about 10% of the whole autistic population. And there is very, very, very little research on language in non-speaking people. So for intermediate speakers, like I said before, there is something of a continuum or a correlation between motor capabilities and your speech capabilities. So there are a lot of intermediate speakers that write very well, write very fluently, but they cannot speak very well. For a lot of non-speakers, the motor capacities tend to be much more limited, so they can write very little. And so I'm hoping that you're starting to see how this connects to hyperlexia. This idea that people can read without understanding what they're reading, can speak without understanding what they're speaking. So the way that this shows up in the literature, even when hyperlexia was first discovered or defined, basically what they did was gave people who at the time were defined as having MR, they would give people a passage to read, and they would read it out loud, but then they wouldn't be able to hold a conversation. They wouldn't be able to answer the researchers' questions, verbally. Even though they were just able to fluently recite a whole passage, when it comes to interacting socially, they can't talk half as fluently as they did just, a minute before when they were reading the passage. This extremely early acquisition of speech is, that is an expression of hyperlexia, but it can also occur throughout your whole life. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean to read without comprehension? What does it mean to speak without understanding what you're saying? This comes down to these fundamental principles of language acquisition, that if all language is equal and you can't, it's impossible to speak language in an inferior way, how is it that you can only have a partial language ability? How can you have some language capabilities but then not actually understand it cognitively? How, what does that even mean? And so that's been the question with hyperlexia since it was discovered, and there's really been very, very little progress in explaining what that means. What I think is that it isn't reading without comprehension. It's not speaking without comprehension. When it comes to these extremely young children, literally 1-year-olds speaking fluently, or reading, not necessarily speaking fluently, but reading very rapidly, I can see how at such a young age, maybe those kids are reading or speaking phonology, but they're just reading the sound system. But when it comes into adulthood, when these are people with, if you look at their brains through MRIs or whatever, they have, pretty normal brains. Why is it that they are still speaking as adults, as fully developed adults? They're speaking without comprehension. That seems like an impossibility to me. I don't think it's possible that you can be a fully developed adult and be speaking and just have no idea what you're saying at all. I think what's happening is that there's a disconnect between internal language and speech production, and so what they want to say is not what's coming out. Or if you're given a piece of paper to read off of, that is accessing different parts of the brain than if you are to speak your own mind. I can't tell you the specifics of how exactly that works because I don't know, because there's so little research on this subject. It's mind-blowing. It presents such fundamental questions about the nature of language that it's really perplexing that there's so little research on this subject, and that there has been so little progress in the last 50 years, that hyperlexia, I can't do that math. And however many years since hyperlexia was discovered, I can show you, I'll show it on the screen, that the questions are the same. The questions that I am presenting right now of what does it mean for linguistic theory to read without comprehension? If we think that all language is equal, like, what does that even mean? What it comes down to is there has to be a lot more research about non-speaking people and limited speaking people, intermediate speaking people, etc. And so part of the reason that there's so little research on this population is, there are a few different reasons that I will go into in the next episode, but one of the main reasons is that there was basically like a parent movement to not have non-speaking autistic people be like studied because they can't give informed consent, right? That means that there is a dearth of research. It's not just there's a gap in the literature or there are holes in the theory that need to be filled in. I mean, it's like a canyon. It's like it just doesn't exist. There's not even like a starting point to say, okay, this is where we need to pick up on. Like, it's so huge. So you might be sitting here thinking, okay, Hope, I can see how this, these intermediate speakers, these people with DLD, comorbid with autism, how they can, through speech, have difficulty and be unreliable, but through writing or through typing, they can express themselves, and that's how you know that the words that they say aren't exactly what they mean to say. But with non-speakers, how can you possibly know that there is a disalignment in what they want to say and the language that is internal versus what they're able to externalize, especially if they have such severe gross and fine motor difficulties. So this is the topic of the next video. This is the topic of part 2, is what's called AAC, Augmentative Alternative Communication Methods. And these are really, really controversial for many reasons that we'll get into. But just to summarize, supposedly people have been able to train non-speakers to use letterboards and to type using different methods. And so over time, they gain the motor capacity to express themselves linguistically. Like I said at the beginning of the video, my perspective is not the mainstream perspective. So my perspective being that all autistic people do have internal language, they do have language capabilities, but they might not be able to necessarily express that through motor capabilities. Even if you completely disagree with me on that, which I hope to prove to you, or at least convince you in the next episode why I think that, when it comes to the critical period hypothesis, which is so foundational to linguistics and to language acquisition, theory, when it comes to, the hyperlexic or tendency of language regression children to acquire speech so early, that doesn't align with what is in the critical period hypothesis. When it comes to losing speech capabilities, that's not in the critical period hypothesis. When it comes to language delays, especially, like not speaking until 7 or 8 years old, one day you can just fluently speak, that's just not what is described in the critical period hypothesis. And one of the stipulations in the hypothesis is that, for all of these milestones, it's like what I said with the vocabulary, it's like you reach these milestones through talking or through sign, whatever. If you're 8 years old and you just started talking out of nowhere when you've been talking very, very little all of your years before that, according to the critical period hypothesis, that shouldn't be possible. In order to acquire language, you have to express language. Like, that's why it was so surprising to me when I first started studying linguistics, was that, like, the critical period hypothesis is looked at very uncritically, when I feel like it's kind of common knowledge that language delays are an aspect of autism, and language delays are one of the more well-researched aspects of autism when it comes to, I mean, just overall the timing of how language acquisition happens among this, like, across the spectrum, but also the results of having this continuum of high speech capabilities to little to no speech capabilities. That is not something that is explained in the critical period hypothesis. If I think that my perspective on autism, of everyone having linguistic minds, is not the mainstream, what is the mainstream? The mainstream idea within the field of psychology is that non-speaking autistic people do not have language capabilities. When it comes to these limited speakers, you know, and there's a really huge range within intermediate limited speakers. You know, like I said, DLD alone has its own spectrum, but, you know, when it comes to the more limited speakers to the non-speakers, the main consensus is that they don't have language capacity. And this isn't really explained, right? In the literature, they'll say that there are language deficits, but they don't define what that means. So, as a linguist who fundamentally believes that all language is equal, and you say, okay, they're speaking, but they're speaking without comprehension, and people have language deficits, like, this idea of language deficits in general is just, like, it doesn't add up with the general understanding of language in the field of linguistics. But when it comes to the psychology of autism, people will just say autism is defined by language deficits. Specifically, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a language deficit? Does that mean having inferior language? Because as far as I'm concerned, that's not possible. I think what's going on is that there is a social construct that makes it such that it appears to be a language deficit, when that is not the reality. And so to go back to the DSM-5 definition and diagnostic criteria for autism and how overbroad it is and overgeneral, I think that could totally change if there was an actual description of this whole range of language, and the range of really, I should say, of language expression. What it looks like to go from exceptional language capabilities that are indistinguishable from non-autistic people to people that literally cannot speak at all. If there was actually a description and investigation into specifically what that looks like, that could really change the diagnostic criteria and make it much more accurate. But in order to do that, we have to figure out the specifics of what that actually looks like first, which, aside from the language and speech characteristics in autism paper that I discussed, there's not very much out there when it comes to defining different levels of speech, or what they called language profiles. You know, that was just a proposal. That other really big problem that I had with the language profiles was the fourth type. So let me just read what it says. Autism with severe difficulties in the development of social communication and social interaction, and secondary language difficulties as a result of non-use of language as a communication tool. This category is debatable due to the difficulties of proving secondary language delay as a result of other factors that are related to the development of social functions in the environment, included the extreme cases of neglect, as in orphanage situations or child abuse and overuse of electronic devices. I'm going to refer to this as the invocation of severe child neglect and abuse as an explanation for non-speaking autism or severe autism. This is not the only paper to do this. If you read any paper about non-speaking autism, you will see this, where they bring up child abuse or neglect, like kind of just as like a suggestion to what could possibly explain non-speaking autism. And first of all, this is kind of shocking to me that this still happens, that this is still something that's brought up in the literature, because for a really long time, parents were blamed for their children's autism. Refrigerator mothers was the term that was used. Basically, they would blame mothers for not being loving enough towards their children, and so, and that was what caused the autism, which was really, really horrible for so many reasons. But that's not exactly what they're saying here, right? They're going, okay, what severe childhood neglect and abuse looks like, the symptoms of that are similar to what non-speaking autism looks like, severe autism. So they're not like explicitly blaming parents. And so this isn't like totally untrue, where in orphanage situations where it's like an orphanage where kids are just left to cry and they're never nurtured at all, they have very little social interaction, very little exposure to language. Like I said, it's in these cases, it's never, when it comes to documented cases, none of them are a total absence of exposure to language. There's never been a documented case of that. Basically, what happens is that kids who grow up in these very tragic situations, as adults, they usually have some kind of physical disability as a result. And they have particular issues with language, and using language to be social. And so kind of what they don't explicitly say this, but what they're trying to say, or what they're implying when they say these things look similar, or these two different situations look similar, even though they're caused by different things, I believe that what they are saying is that there is something that is happening in the autistic brain, in the severely autistic brain, that prevents language input, that prevents these children from absorbing the information around them. So it's almost as though, instead of, the orphanage situation where children are excluded from social situations and they have very little exposure to language, there's something that's happening in the brain, that in the autistic brain, that does that on its own, where it prevents information from coming in on its own so that language doesn't develop. And that's generally the assertion, that non-speakers never actually developed language. So I think this is a really superficial comparison. On the surface, they might look similar, but I think they are very, very, very different. First of all, because, parents of non-speaking children do so much for their kids. But I think if you look at the most extreme case of childhood neglect, the most extreme documented case of childhood neglect, you'll see that this doesn't add up. So the most extreme case of this, and this is a very, very sad story, about a girl named Jeannie who was very severely abused by her father. He locked her in a room, strapped her to a chair. He didn't let anyone else go into the room. He didn't let her speak. He did not let anyone speak to her for about 13 years. So that's well past the critical period. One day, her, thank God, her mother, who was very severely disabled, she was blind, her dad was out, and so her mom took her out to run an errand to go to some kind of, disability, governmental disability help center, And what she accidentally did was walk into a social services center with her daughter, Jeannie, and the social workers very quickly went, okay, there's something very, very wrong with that child. And she was taken by the state, and several different linguists spent a very, very long time trying to help her learn language, because she was not sufficiently exposed to language such that she could acquire it herself. And what they found was that she was able to acquire words. She learned words, individual words, very quickly, content words. What she couldn't acquire were more functional words. So these are, functional grammar. That's, the, prepositions, different parts of speech that have syntactic information that don't have content information, like a noun or a verb. And that was also with, morphology. Using suffixes or any kind of affix was difficult for her. She would use, I think it was or and interchangeably. So when it came to the syntax, she wasn't able to acquire syntax, and when she would start to make progress in acquiring the syntax, she would very quickly lose it when she stopped the training. What we will see in part 2 in the autism industrial complex, when it comes to the non-speakers who learn how to type or to write or to spell, to communicate, the language that they have is perfect. The grammar that they have is perfect. They do not have to be taught syntax. They have full syntactic capabilities, and it's just nothing like what happened with Jeannie. It's a totally different story, where the people that do end up learning to write or to type or to spell, it's full grammar, and it does not have to be explicitly taught to them. And what they end up talking about when they, in the content of their writing, they say, I have always been listening. My whole life, I have always been listening to the things that have been said to me, that have been said near me, everything. We're going to get into how that's possible. How is it possible that people are able to learn how to use augmentative alternative communication methods when they are non-speakers? So, I know that was a lot. That was a ton of information, and if you were listening and understanding everything that I was saying, you probably have a lot of questions, and that's a good thing, because that's exactly where you're supposed to be at this point, is having a lot of questions about what that means. And so specifically, the question that I have, or that I propose, especially for all you psychologists out there, is when it comes to language in autism, the continuum of language in autism, from high speech capabilities to no speech capabilities. If you believe that non-speakers do not have a capacity for language, where do you draw the line? At what point on that continuum do you say, okay, is it after DLD? Is there, there's the fully fluent speakers to intermediate speakers with DLD, and then you draw the line and say, okay, these are the people that have no capacity for language. Because it's, I've been describing these different levels of speech, but there is no hard line between, especially between intermediate speakers and more limited speakers to non-speakers, the people in the minimally verbal category, where they might be able to say sentences and full phrases, but it's still very limited. At what point do you say, okay, these people lack a capacity for language? Where do you draw the line? Because I don't think there is a line. And even though the mainstream psychological concept of autism defines non-speakers as lacking linguistic abilities, they can't answer that question. They can't answer the question of exactly who and exactly where you can confidently assert that people don't have language capacities. And so that's going to be the subject of part 2. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.